What's up? This is Austin.
Aloysius here.
Hi, this is Jia Wei.
Kenneth here.
Zillion here.
Hey guys, I'm just curious. Do you guys actually use story points in your Scrum teams or not? I keep hearing a lot about it.
Of course,
For my
most of my teams use.
experience,
Yeah.
yeah, for me now it's a mixture of some squads, call it squads or teams, use it, and some doesn't even use it.
I've worked with teams that use story points, but I've also worked with teams that do not. Yeah. So in place of story points, they do kind of like more time estimation.
That's interesting.
Mm.
For
Seems like
yeah,
there's
for
quite a
some,
range. Both have
yeah,
and use and don't use. Anyone want to share
yes.
why teams use or don't use story points?
Okay, let me start. My perspective is, yeah, some Scrum teams are just being uh, kick off without a proper, you can say not a proper, but without this knowledge of you need to use story points, because yeah, some, it depends on really on the perspective of the trainer, Scrum trainer, or call it agile coach. Some are really prescribing story points, and some doesn't even believe story points.
So
I think
people,
for me, if they don't use story points, they are probably doing Kanban. Yeah, that's a straightforward thing.
For me, it's because sometimes it's hard for the team to estimate stories based on size if the stories are sliced more by function or by what task needs to be done. And so the team finds it easier to estimate in days or time estimation rather than story points. Um, Another thing I realized is sometimes even though we ask the team or some there are coaches that prescribe story points for certain teams to use, they might use story points, but actually they're still thinking about how many days it will take roughly for them to complete that particular story or task. And because of this, essentially, in my perspective, they're still not really using story points.
That
so
reminds me of the no estimates movement. I think it's I think the philosophy behind is that if it's very high priority and important, you still have to do it anyway. So there's no point in wasting time estimating. Yeah.
Yeah. But on
Um,
the other side of it is that it's also for the management to gauge how much work is needed, especially if it's really a big chunk of work. And this is where if the company is just transitioning from traditional way of like waterfall, and which already they are quite familiar with the Gantt chart, right? So this is where we have some clashes about, yeah, why are you not even estimating when can this be done, or and so on.
yes, I agree with Kenneth. I think what Aloysius said is nice, but it's very hard to convince everyone else in the company, I suppose, if there are no estimations at all, because I think there'll be a lot of questions asked, although there might be perks or benefits that come with it for sure.
Mm.
so it seems like we have quite a myriad of different experiences with story point usages in their teams. But uh, maybe I want to learn a bit more. What do your what is the general consensus of what story points are for? Like, what is the purpose of story points in a team?
I think
Okay,
for
so
me it's for alignment,
yeah, go ahead, Aloysius. Sorry.
for alignment purpose. Yeah. I think it's a common understanding within the team. I think that's key. And yeah, to discuss the um like the relative sizing of something. Yeah, and the scope. Yeah, I think that this is a discussion for the team. It's for alignment.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same points as what has Aloysius has shared.
I think that is true, but A lot of times, sometimes it's also used, I guess, for estimation. I guess debatable. But if we're running some kind of a cadence or some kind of iteration or sprint, then we want to kind of understand how much can fit in that sprint. So although actually if like the team is working as a team and we're working as a cross-functional team, then in order to do that, we need some kind of currency together for that alignment as well to understand the stories and such and such. And so I feel like that's where the story points is kind of like a currency that comes in. But then there's to reach that cross functionality and for everyone to be able to estimate the stories together, which I feel like is kind of a prerequisite for alignment, is not easy to reach. There's a lot of teams that are not cross functional enough, and therefore there are people who argue, oh, I can't estimate this story because I don't know enough about it. Then that's where we start going away from using story points as a tool or story point estimation as a tool to reaching some kind of alignment when there are some members who feel like for certain stories they don't want to or they don't feel comfortable participating in the estimation.
I think that's the point that you want to have a conversation to have some convergence with the whole team within the whole team. So if someone is uncomfortable, I think whole team, including product owner, is responsible to align, to explain, to have that conversation. I think that's the key part behind. But speaking of story points as a currency, have you all checked out the person who come up with the article about apologizing for inventing this story points thing? I think the person is Ron Jeffries. What, have you all read the article?
Oh yeah. Ron Jeffries, the originator or you can say founder of this story point. So coming from extreme programming practices.
It was a very interesting article. Was there anything that struck you? Anything you particularly agreed with or you would like to raise for discussion?
So I think the famous quote is by him is I like to say that I may have invented story points, and if I did, I'm sorry now. So I think that's
Yeah.
a key quote from him. I think he did mention some of the fallacies of using story points. I think the one of them is for prediction. It's a weak idea. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree that it's quite weak because especially in this world of R&D or software engineering, there's just a lot of unknowns and sometimes we might underestimate ourselves, but it's really quite easy. It's just like there's a lot of things that you need to check. But there's also that we might think on our first estimate that this is quite easy, but then when you start to do it you need to have a lot of things to do, like for example libraries or Dango and whatsoever. So that's the challenge really, if you really put a lot of effort for estimation and especially with using story points. So yeah, I agree on that perspective of like it's not really quite accurate.
I feel like it's because a lot of people kind of equate estimation with prediction. We estimated that these are the things that fit in the sprint, but it's not actually a prediction that we'll finish all of these things at the end of this sprint, if you get what I mean. Like we always emphasize that the story point estimation is just an estimation, so it doesn't really indicate what finishes in the end. So I just feel like it's true, yes, we shouldn't use it for prediction, but at the same time, I kind of haven't thought of something that stands out a lot that is for estimation. What does everyone think?
So I think also the tricky part that was also, I would say, highlighted also is the original intention, at least that was mentioned in the article, was more towards ideal. The thing is, we are in the real world, so there will definitely be, as mentioned earlier, some things is not so maybe straightforward. Then there's also the highlight of dependencies. as much as we try to make our stories invest. So invest is actually an acronym for the ideal way of, in a
Independent,
sense,
yeah.
independent,
Independent, negotiable, valuable. What's that? Valuable is
Estimatable,
estimatable,
estimatable.
small,
and
testable.
small and
Yes.
testable. Mm.
Well,
Yeah.
ideally, we want those. We try to work towards it, but after all, this is the real world. Sometimes we can't achieve all of those, and that's where it gets a bit tricky with story points and estimations.
So there's always this pro and cons, right? If you get too serious about really very accurately using story points and put a lot of effort, then probably it's not really worth it. Or otherwise, if we just omit it, then we lose those benefits that you have just shared, Chilean, right? We will lose those benefits, especially when you converse with other people about how you perceive story, especially with this discussion between one developer to the other, or maybe one developer to the scrum master and product owner and the stakeholder. So yeah, point taken. Agree with you.
Yes, but back to this prediction. I think we cannot predict exactly. I think what is actually delivered is probably not exactly what is estimated. But what about uh, confidence level? Will that work for estimation? That means we can probably finish 80% or 70% of the estimate. How does that work? Is that working for your organization in predicting like what or your experiences or yeah what
Well,
are
as
the
long
yeah
well, as long as the higher organization or the management is not tending or not inclining to compare points from one team to another, then it will be it's quite
Hmm.
useful, right?
Yeah,
Or
speaking
they
of
are
comparing, yeah,
yes.
sorry, continue. Yeah.
But once you have that comparison, like why is this that the other team delivers more points, or why is it that when I presented this is pretty much or for a pretty much similar feature, the story point estimate from this team is much lesser than yours, then we've got a problem there, because we are people and we see things differently.
Yes, I think one of the things you mentioned is also the people comparing teams. And I think he's hinted at some approaches in Agile, trying to normalize this aligning this story points estimation. So what do you think about this? I personally
Yeah.
disagree. Yeah.
I disagree as well. Actually, for some of my teams, when we think about wanting to switch to story points, we often discuss what's the baseline for one story point, because everything should be relative from that. So if you already know that there's this story that is likely the smallest story that you work on a day-to-day basis, then that would probably be one. But does one story point really take one day to finish in the old world, like before they started using story points? Actually, no one defines that. That's why I feel like it's a currency. Like for this team, one story point might take one day. For the other team, one story point might take half a day. Then it'll be very hard to compare in that sense. And I don't feel like it's justified in any way, even if it's similar in any sense. So it's really just for estimation. I understand how, like, in the article it says it's not for prediction, which I agree to some extent as well, because I feel like it's more for estimation anyways.
Okay, so here's the thing. I completely agree with both of you disagreeing with the points. But I've always been thinking about it from another perspective, right? Story points are always talking about how much value the team is sort of delivering to the organization by form of either estimating or predicting to some sense. But what kind of value does it deliver to the employees in terms of
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I disagree that story points estimate the value delivered. I feel like story points only estimates the size of the story, which doesn't necessarily equate the value it delivers.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that means
It's
in
not
short,
really
like
about the value. Yeah.
Yeah, one story point can be very, very more valuable than a 13 story point story, yeah, for example.
Yeah.
If I might chime in, story points, yes, business value is considered, but there's a lot of other factors. Example, potential risk, whether, and then there's also a lot of things like dependencies, a lot of other factors, of course, depending on team experience and what factors are considered. So, I would say in terms of story points, there is many factors. It's not just business
Mm.
value full stop.
Mm. And one thing we should remember also is that story points is nowhere found in the Scrum guide. So
Yeah.
technically, if you don't use any story points, you're still not deviating from the Scrum guide as it should be.
But
Yes,
back to Austin's question. Sorry, Aloysius. And I just want to say back to Austin's question about what value it brings to the employee. I think like we were talking about at the beginning of the call, it was more about like alignment. At least if we use like story points, we can try and ensure alignment within the team. I think it also helps the team visualize the size of the story in order to use it as an estimation to plan for the coming iteration or sprint. And that will also help them in terms of not being overloaded and stuff like that, or being like too burnt out, etc.
yes. I think Austin bring out a very good point. So the key is to deliver value for the sprint. It's not about delivering how many story points. So I think, yeah, the story point is just a guide, essentially. Okay. I think one more thing he mentioned is tracking how actual compared to estimate is wasteful. What do you think?
Well, if too much effort is really having that, then yeah, it will
Agreed.
be wasteful. So just make it sweet and short. That's it.
So I sometimes pick up one or two stories and compare with the actual time taken. Yeah,
I think this brings us back to Aloysius.
for retrospective. Yeah.
This kind of brings us back to Aloysius' point at the start where he was talking about the no estimate movement. Where if it really boils down to too much effort, then what's the point of estimating important tickets?
Okay, that's a good discussion. We've learned a lot.
So are we
of
still using
perspective.
story points?
Well, depends on the context and
I mean,
whichever team finds it valuable. Jillian?
if it helps the team, then if there is actual value, why not?
Yes, I think depending on the situation at that point in time, if the team can do without story point and the management or organization trust the team, I think they can do without it. Yeah, but otherwise, we can use that. Yeah.
Agreed. But I feel like there are also prerequisites to using story point. In order for the team to actually value the alignment that comes with doing story point estimation, certain things about the team needs to be true. And if not, then the value of using story point estimation might not be realized in the team. Great.
Good.
Looks like we had a really nice discussion. Thank you everyone for today's
Indeed.
podcast. We'll see you next
Thank
time.
you. See you next
Bye.
time.
Isn't that
Bye.
awesome?
Toodaloo.